Of all the games that Fromsoftware has developed, Bloodborne is one of the most unique standouts in its library, and holds a very special place among Fromsoftware fans. While it contains pretty much the same DNA as its Dark Souls counterpart, down to its controls, systems, and this asshole pushing you off a cliff, it's the unique things that the game employs that makes Bloodborne very special. Trick weapons for every type of hunter out there to customize how they fight, firearms to employ a fast-paced counter system, fashion to show how much cooler leather looks than armor, sorry armor bros, a doll who loves you,
I do love you,
and a dark, macabre world rich with lore and history that makes this one of the best action RPG horror games. Though I'm sure it's more horrifying for the people of Yharnam than it is for you. It was extremely well received on release, thanks to its offshoot evolution of the Souls formula and the heavier emphasis on a dark and mysterious world brimming with detail and atmosphere. Not to mention, it's one of the best Lovecraftian-inspired games that honestly does it better than most actual Lovecraftian games, and many fans, including myself, have been wishing for a sequel or an updated re-release for the game. Though Nightmare Cart was a fun sequel parody that I didn't know I needed. Bloodborne was also the primary FromSoft game that actually got me into the Souls genre, and taught me a very important lesson about getting good. Also, it was in my top 3 of 2015, with the other 2 battling it out for Game of the Year. But while Bloodborne itself was a defining standout, how does the game fare after 10 years? Considering that the later FromSoftware games like Sekiro that have elevated the pace of the Souls-style combat, and especially Elden Ring involving the entire system as a whole, does Bloodborne still stand to be unique amongst them today?
What's that smell?
The story of Bloodborne is an eldritch mystery that will probably require all the madman's knowledge in your inventory, as well as the full use of your single brain cell to understand. Set in the fictional Victorian-inspired city of Yharnam, the player character known as the Hunter is first seen talking to an elderly man in a wheelchair about seeking pale blood, to which the elderly man shares that Yharnam would be the best location to find it. After receiving a rather nightmarish blood transfusion, God, I hope this never happens to me in real life,
Oh no!
the player character is transported to the city of Yharnam. From here, the hunter travels through the city, learning all of its deep dark secrets, like how the bestial scourge first started due to the scholarly misuse of the Old Blood, the mysteries of the Great Ones and their presence in Yharnam, the other unseen locations, the nightmares that are present, and the greatest mystery of all, how the hell did Patches become a spider? It's a very traditional FromSoftware narrative experience that's all about bringing intrigue to the world while ensuring that the players unravel the answers themselves. More often than not, the concrete answers are never really fully given, and speculation is still to this day the best answer that we'll ever get. While I sort of both remembered and forgot most of the plot points of Bloodborne over the years, coming back to it was an absolute treat. It contains many of the Souls storytelling aspects, like item descriptions that reveal and connect important ideas and figures, mysterious characters that never give the full story, environmental details that often appear vague and macabre until you actually learn their significance. It's all an amazing mystery that, once you piece together, makes for one bloody good setting, pun intended. I think this particular style of quote-unquote in-game storytelling and narrative reveal has been one of FromSoftware's strongest aspects in both their past and current game design, something I've come to appreciate over the years. The vagueness of how Yharnam's story unfolds while trying to infer and make connections using the items, entities, and locations makes unraveling the mystery feel more meaningful for the player. Sort of like how you're reaching that aha moment, but made better because the game doesn't try to shove it down your throat, and you get to figure it out yourself. Though I wouldn't fault you if guys like Vati are there to help, because yes, it can be very convoluted if you don't know where to look.
Hello there.
Plus, I think it's thematically appropriate as an outside character looking in, where you're dropped into the middle of a city that's going through something, and you're trying to understand bits and pieces without anyone there to really guide you.
I haven't heard of pale blood, but that's your best bet if it's anything to do with unique types of blood.
But while I've already experienced Yharnam's story before, coming back to it again and remembering all of the answers and mostly questions that I still have with the plot reminded me how much of an amazing and deep world Bloodborne is. Things like why Ebrietas, I think I'm pronouncing her name right, Is the most kind old one of them all, the connection between Bergenwerf, the old hunters, and Rom, or who is Murgo and their wet nurse? The abundance of answers and questions to these plot points are what really makes the game intriguing as ever. As for the age, it's a timeless story mystery for me. Even when I've been through the motions of Dark Souls plot points and trying to examine every nook and cranny of Elden Ring's massive world, thanks again Elden Ring story interpreters, Bloodborne's world hits just as strong. Maybe it's because the Lovecraftian and Dark Souls fan in me is screaming out, and Bloodborne really helps scratch both itches, but it's just such a unique setting that I still found myself engrossed in it after all these years. Also, and this may be a more personal opinion, but it feels like Bloodborne's lore mystery is the most intriguing out of all the Fromsoftware games. I do like the fantasy of Dark Souls, the more historical period of Sekiro, the epic fantasy of Elden Ring, but the darker mystery of Yharnam and how the city fell apart captivated me most of all, and was actually the biggest reason I was hooked onto the game, way before my need to get good and beat difficult bosses. Of course, if you aren't one for convoluted storytelling and need something more direct, then Bloodborne and pretty much all the Fromsoftware games, except maybe Sekiro, aren't for you. But you'd be hard-pressed to find a world like Bloodborne rich in such dark and grotesque detail, and even with 10 years gone by, you can barely feel the age.
My blood! He punched out all my blood!
Borrowing heavily from its developer's Souls series, it's a big mouthful with the S's, much of the gameplay and systems remain the same, but with a few tweaks that make the experience feel different. It's still very much the third-person difficult as hell combat, where you go around the world slashing or blunting your way through enemies, and when you die, which you will do a lot of, you drop all of your acquired currency that you need for purchases and upgrades, and you have to go find them again before you lose them on death. You'll be moving from place to place, finding enemies and bosses that you'll have to defeat in order to progress through the game. The more familiar soul systems include things like the health and stamina bar, light and heavy attacks, healing at the press of a button, upgrading your attributes, as well as the equipping of items and gear for your character. The difference is the Bloodborne exclusive mechanics, which change the way you approach combat. You have the rally system, where after taking damage, you can actually regain a portion of your health back when you attack enemies, making it an interesting risk-reward mechanic to utilize in combat. Kinda like the precursor to Millennia, except she does it better than you.
We get it!
You have the gun parry system, where if you shoot an enemy just before an attack lands, you get to make a visceral attack, which is extremely satisfying. You can also do one after backstabbing an enemy with a charge heavy attack. You have the two-form weapon system, which allows you to modify a weapon into its alternate form, giving you additional modes of attack. You have a socketable gem slot system, where you can improve or modify a weapon's damage to make it more customizable to your character. You have equipable Carol runes with different buffs. And lastly, your evade button can double as a roll when you're not locked on, and a directional dash when you are, making your maneuverability significantly faster on both offense and defense. In essence, it's a much faster paced Souls game, but with the heavier emphasis on the visceral, no pun intended, close range combat. In fact, much more so, because the game actually lacks the variety of magic or long range weapons, so melee is kind of the only option for you to do, for the most part. But actually coming back to the mechanics and remembering how to parry, as well as get used to the more maneuverable player character, the game felt great to play again, barring one or two technicalities that I'll explain in a sec. Even though both Sekiro and Elden Ring currently sit as FromSoft's faster-paced combat, and Night Rain possibly soon, Bloodborne's combat still felt actiony and fast-paced. Learning to quickly weave in and out of enemy attacks to find your opportunities, leveraging whether to use the rally system to get your health back, or finding the counters in an opponent's offense is very much a Bloodborne-only combat experience. Exploration is more on par with the older, more enclosed games of FromSoft, basically everything Dark Souls 3 and back, where the areas feel more claustrophobic and tight in terms of corridors. This isn't bad, but you will feel the difference if you're coming from something like Elden Ring or even Sekiro to some extent. I like the tighter corridors actually, since the claustrophobicness added to the more horror-themed vibe of Bloodborne. It can also get pretty jump scary sometimes. Whoa, holy shit, brother! It also has the love it or hate it, not so straightforward side quest system, where you'll have to pay close attention to where a character is or what they need you to do. It is pretty fun, because learning all of the different characters really adds to the game's lore, but it is still very confusing and convoluted to try to get it done. Heck, even though I finished the game before, I still needed a guide for certain quests. Honestly, this system has been used up until Elden Ring, so it's nothing really too unfamiliar for those who have seen it before. But if it's your first time, just don't be surprised when things happen the way they shouldn't.
Blimey, don't scare me like that. On a night like this, I took you for a monster.
I think the only weird case coming back to this game is that the bosses actually feel easier to fight. Now, they are fun and challenging, and some did still put me into the ground again.
Why are you running?
But I think having mastered the parry system and overall feel of combat, as well as having gone through the recent and seriously difficult bosses of Fromsoft, the Bloodborne bosses just feel a bit easy by comparison. This might just be a personal bias, and speaking as a Fromsoft masochist. I'd say a few minor inconveniences are the quality of life changes that aren't present in this game, like how you always have to go back to the Hunter's Dream to fast travel anywhere, or that you have to constantly buy blood vials and quicksilver bullets, otherwise you run out. It wasn't that arduous for me, especially when you know how to farm, or just get good and not die so much, but it may be a chore for those who have never seen the game before, and especially when you're coming from the auto-replenish system of literally every other game. The Chalice dungeons, which are these dungeon-style encounters that you can go through, were pretty fun the first time I went through them back in the day, but they honestly didn't really feel impactful for me to go through again. Of course, there are some exclusive enemies and instances for you to do, as well as some items that you can retrieve, but I didn't really invest my time into thinking about them too much, because they honestly felt a little repetitive every time I did them again. But if it is your first time, I still recommend you go through them. Now, for the most glaring issue in all of Bloodborne is the performance, and it's the fact that the game runs at 30 frames per second, and occasionally dips even lower than that. For the most part, I didn't mind the frame rate on the PS4 because I was able to adjust to the 30 FPS whenever it was stable, but when the game suddenly dips as a result of particle effects, or even just larger models coming to the screen, I didn't think the game would suddenly become a PowerPoint presentation. It wasn't the biggest deal breaker for me personally, but I will admit I did feel a bit cheated on occasions where I took a hit because trying to dodge at the right time felt off or even delayed. But I would say these issues only happened in about 5% of the game for me, and everything else was fine. You'll definitely feel this though if you're coming from something like Sekiro or Elden Ring that normally hit 60 FPS. I'm not sure if the PS5 improves the performance during gameplay, and the only thing I've really heard is that the load times are just faster. And lastly, my only other gripe has to be Bloodborne's camera. I'd say FromSoft has gotten better with their camera keeping track of bosses in their later games, but I want to say that Bloodborne kinda feels like their worst. It's been a while since I've played the first Dark Souls or even the original Demon Souls, but I don't really recall the camera being that big of an issue in those games. Here though, oh man does it hurt sometimes. Mainly when you try to get close to a large boss only for everything else to step out of view, or the boss is asking you out on a date and kabedoning you to the wall. It's not an issue with the smaller bosses just by virtue of their size, but oh boy is it a fun time to get the camera right on those big ones. Usually I just be aggressive and hope that they aren't swinging for another attack, or I just have to back out in fear. I did get through everything fine, and I think Cleric Beast was really my only issue, but just be aware that the camera will not always be your best friend. Despite the performance setback and the wonky camera, the gameplay was still fun to go through, and I very much enjoyed the Bloodborne style combat and the more traditional Souls exploration. For a 10-year-old game, Bloodborne actually still looks extremely impressive. I think the only real blemish in terms of graphical presentation are the fine details that would make the game more polished, like better anti-aliasing on both the environments and character models, as well as some better surface detail in general. Also, your hunter's facial model does look a bit plasticky now, especially when you consider how far FromSoft has come with their facial modeling. But even then, The overall presentation of literally everything in Bloodborne looks absolutely gorgeous. The clothing models and how detailed the accessories look on the garments. Also, just look how bloody you can get.
Bloody hell!
The various enemy types that range from the smallest alien to the largest beast, the vastness and scale of the buildings, the colored lighting from the sky, and of course the heavy use of shaders to give Bloodborne its dark vibe. I would say the shadows in just about everything is one half of what really defines the mood and visual tone of Bloodborne. Funny how this game manages to feel darker than Dark Souls. But the other half goes to the art style. The Victorian-inspired architecture cements Yharnam in its specific time period, the brutish denizens that live there, the savage-looking beasts that were once human, especially the ones that tower over you, the more grotesque and eldritch-looking beings that would drive you mad. No, really, they will drive you mad, and mad! Except you, Ebrietas. You're beautiful. The environments that question whether you think these statues are real or not, it's a lot of pieces that combine to give Bloodborne its gothic-themed eldritch horror. Still, it's both the combination of the overall shading and how it presents the aesthetics of Yharnam and beyond that help establish the visual identity of Bloodborne. Honestly, I think it's more visually striking than any other FromSoft game. Not saying FromSoft's other IPs are lacking, but Bloodborne just has a certain wow factor that really impresses on first sight. Again, this may just be my gothic eldritch horror fan screaming out louder than my weeb or fantasy fan. Psst, hey FromSoft, could you do sci-fi too? Also, just like every FromSoft title, everything is told through in-game models and animations, so there's nothing externally used that would ruin the immersion. The sound front is excellent. The effects feel natural with trying to portray a wandering stranger that has entered the city of Yharnam, riddled with all manners of deranged citizens, wild beasts, and otherworldly beings. Since the game is almost always free of music during its main portions, you will often be left alone with ambient noise and the sound of its denizens trying to kill you. It's an extremely good fit for Bloodborne, especially since it's trying to go for a more horror-themed atmosphere, so the lack of music can make the mood feel very tense. There's also the more ethereal and otherworldly effects that occasionally play when you're transitioning between locations or whenever you gain insight, which both sound cool and unsettling. Speaking of music though, when the pieces do play, they definitely enhance the mood. You'll be hearing music whenever you're in the Hunter's Dream, which is more peaceful and calming, and quite beautiful actually. While most musical pieces will play during boss fights, and they will always raise the urgency and tension. They all sound amazing, and FromSoft has never let a boss in Bloodborne feel boring. The voice acting is pretty good too. It's not the most abundant since there's not that much story dialogue occurring, but it's enough to make both the conversations feel important whenever you talk to the NPCs, and haunting whenever you see the Yharnamites sound desperate.
Oh no, I haven't forgotten. Do you think I owe you something? Well, that's a fine lark, I'd say. This whole mess that Yharnam's in, it's all your fault. Stupidity outsiders.
You're a beast hunter, aren't you? I knew it. That's precisely how I started out. Oh, beg pardon. You may call me Alfred, protege of Master Ligurius, hunter of vile bloods.
Hello, good hunter. I am a doll, here in this dream to look after you. Honorable hunter, pursue the echoes of blood, and I will channel them into your strength.
An amazingly dark, gritty presentation, and Bloodborne's Victorian and Gothic-inspired aesthetic is still a treat to see as well as hear.
It's blood!
Despite the Souls formula evolving over the years, moving from shinobi parrying man to guy who lacks luster and tries to put a ring on it, Bloodborne can still play pretty well. It sucks when it's more of a performance age that hinders the game from playing better than it should, and can even hurt the player. But honestly, despite the performance, and despite the strongest boss in the game being the camera, going back to Bloodborne felt great. It was a combination of the offshoot Souls combat with the close-range visceral fights, alongside the world of Yharnam and its unseen denizens that make it such an enthralling world to step in. I could say the same for just about every Fromsoftware game has put out, because worlds like Dark Souls, Sekiro, and Elden Ring have so much detail and lore to them that also makes them worth going through. The Lords of the First Flame, the history of Ashina, Queen Marika's family, the Maiden in Black's feet. All these worlds are riddled with exciting and intricate lore for you to dive into. But there's something enchanting about the cosmic and bestial horror of Bloodborne that makes it so unique. Everything from the hunter stepping into Yharnam to the old ones that work behind the scenes, there's a strong mystery at work here that I feel like no other game has even come close to mimicking. It's also just great that FromSoft tackled a more horror-themed version of their game design, and it arguably suits it best with the way Yharnam is. As for the game itself, I'd say if you're willing to deal with some of the performance dips that still hinder it, you'll find that Bloodborne is still a very good and challenging game with some of the best atmospheric horror even after 10 years. But that's gonna do it for today, guys. Thanks for sticking around. There will be more games to play and more videos coming soon, so please stay tuned if you'd like to see more. But for now, I'll see you all next time.